So I want to thank everybody for coming out today. I really want to thank this incredible school. I'm almost embarrassed to tell you how many years I've been visiting this incredible school, McKinley. I want to thank everybody from the leader of our school, from the principal all the way down to the faculty, the staff, the volunteers. This is an incredible school community that has a rich tradition of not only academic achievement and success, but really being an integrated part of our community. And as having been the Central Ward Councilman and walked these streets for a very long time, I'm just so happy to see this school continuing to thrive under great leadership, great passion for the most important part of American society, which is our children and our future. I also want to thank everybody for coming together. You can see there's a very large group around me of very, very beautiful, luminescent people. And the bill that we're announcing today is not the Cory Booker bill. This is really a bill that has been worked on and shaped and contributed to by many different people over many months. Environmental activists, community activists, people not just from New Jersey, but across our country. Many hands have made for really good work. And that's why I'm very happy to be a part of a larger community. And that's really where I want to start, not just with my thank yous to this school community, not just my thank yous to Mayor Baraka, who could not be here this morning, but really I want to start with this understanding of this, that we're all in this together. If there's anything that I've learned about this nation's ideals, from the hallmark of our country, e pluribus unum, to the spiritual reality of our nation, of diversity, of many different communities, that we're all integrated into one common destiny, and that injustice anywhere is indeed a threat to justice everywhere. And indeed, environmental injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. You can't just contain off areas and think that that poison, that toxic environment is not affecting the whole. I became an environmentalist, I have to be honest and candid with you, not worrying about the effect of global warming sometime in the future. And again, I support all issues working on climate change. But I became an environmentalist because of the community that we're standing in right now. I became an environmentalist because I realized that the most urgent issues facing my community weren't just great schools or trying to make sure there's safety and security. When I started coming up, when Newark started raising me up in my public life, I began to see horrific examples of environmental injustice and how that was hurting my community in every single way. I came in the 1990s when the lead paint crisis in this city was almost at epidemic levels, and the elevated blood lead levels, not just the lead poisoning levels, which were at rates that were too high, but just the elevated blood lead levels were affecting children's success in school, affecting children's success in life. But then that started to be compounded with other things that I saw. With the #1 reason in all of America, but concentrated in urban communities, the #1 health challenge was issues like asthma. And then when I eventually became mayor, I began to get even more angry about the environmental conditions of this city, and know that it was not just contained in Newark, but this was a reality for millions and millions of Americans. We found out when we tried to do urban gardening that we couldn't plant in the soil in Newark. The EPA was stopping us in areas of our city because the soil was toxic. And so here I knew already that the air had toxicity levels that were unacceptable. And now they were telling me the soil. Well, also the water. There are schools from Camden to Newark that kids are still drinking out of bottled water because of the lead in the water. And we know that here we stand right now within 5 miles of 2 Superfund sites, one of them being the Passaic River itself. So what happens to a community in this nation where you're alienated from your environment in every way? When you're alienated from the air, when you're alienated from the water, when you're alienated from the soil, what happens to a community when there's toxins in the air they breathe, in the water, and as well as in the land? And to me, that is an outrageous and unacceptable condition. And that condition has been driven by bad actors. One is that the governments often that are there to protect citizens. The reason why we formed the United States of America in the first place was to protect our citizenry for the common defense. And the government was not doing its job. In fact, it was often permissive and complicit in the very poisoning of our nation, of our state. And then on top of that, the worst type of corporate villainy where they've been outsourcing, many corporations were outsourcing their costs onto communities and internalizing their profits, often stealing the land and the river and the commons from the community in order to enrich themselves. And the frustrating thing, the anger I have, is not just about the communities in which I live, like Newark, or I represent around our state, but the understanding that this is not an anomaly here in New Jersey. That all over the United States of America, we see communities that are suffering in the same kind of way. I've now traveled across this nation and most recently been in communities around the nation. For example, I visited North Carolina and Duplin County, where longtime residents now share their backyards with 2 million hogs, and where the hog waste is stored in these massive open air lagoons, and they're used where that feces is sprayed untreated across fields adjacent to people's homes, where folks in churches and schools and homes can't open their windows, can't run their air conditioning, can't hang their laundry out on lines, where their very safety and security has been stolen from them by corporations who are outsourcing the costs of their businesses onto their communities, where people have respiratory diseases and other ailments that are at higher levels because of these toxins that have been injected into their communities. I visited Tallahassee and Uniontown in Alabama, 2 historically black communities where residents' quality of life has been ruined by giant industrial garbage dumps that moved into their neighborhoods. They had no say. They had no democratic participation in the process. These toxic dumps were put into their communities, and again, they too are having their air and their land and their water being stolen from them because of this corporate villainy. I visited Africa Town in Mobile, Alabama, where this historic village, founded by the last captured Africans ever brought to the United States, has endured decades of industrial development that has degraded and degraded a once vibrant community. I stood on a children's baseball field and watched how oil companies just sent pipes right underneath their community, and how the kids and the families are complaining about the health impacts of the industrial activity right around them. I visited the coastal plain of southeastern Louisiana, where residents of this parish are faced with coastal land loss driven not just by climate change and rising sea level, but by decades of industrial scale energy development that is literally driving them off of their land. I was in St. James Parish, in a heavily industrialized region along the Mississippi River, infamously nicknamed Cancer Alley. And I heard from residents who've battled chronic illnesses and cancers, who've lost countless friends and relatives to the vile disease, but who cannot afford to move away because they can't sell their homes. The homes that they inherited from their family, the property values have been driven down, and now nobody wants to buy their homes to move into a community called Cancer Alley. And so for months now, I've been visiting communities that, though they may be in long distance places, they're fighting the same fight as communities right here in New Jersey. They're dealing with the same challenges of permissive governments that allow these illnesses and these toxins to be placed in their communities, and battling with a corporate villainy that seems to want to put these toxins in communities but would never tolerate these things put into their own homes or their own neighborhoods. This has got to stop. And for too long, community activists like those standing behind me, community groups like those standing with me here today, haven't had the tools necessary to hold people accountable for this injustice. And that's why we brought forward this bill. This bill is not a panacea, but it's going to arm localities and communities with the tools necessary to begin to better fight back against this kind of villainy that's going on, to begin to try to right the wrongs and correct the injustices that are happening, that are at the base of the ideals of this nation. You cannot have life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness if your communities are injected with toxins that are literally poisoning your families. And so we now have in this legislation some common sense tools making sure that presidents who've tried to address this through executive actions, that those can't just be removed by another president that doesn't share values of environmental justice. So this bill codifies a lot of those gains. Number two is this bill works to make sure that when we are looking at permitting in the United States government or at state levels, that when they're permitting a factory or a chemical plant or permitting something that's moving into a community, that those governments have an obligation, a legal obligation, to look at the totality of the environmental circumstances in that community. That they can't just look at this in a vacuum and say, well, one more power plant, this in and of itself is poisoning the communities. They have to look at the collective impact of these things and what it's doing to families. And then the third major element of this bill that gets me very excited, because we've seen the erosion of people's civil rights. Civil rights have to include fundamentally the right to breathe your air, the right to plant tomatoes in your soil. Civil rights is the right to drink your water. And so this bill gives people the right to take action, to sue their governments as necessary. It gives them the right to take civil rights claims to make sure that they can find justice. And so I want you to know that I have come a long way thanks to the community we're standing in right now. When I was just a 20-something-year-old law student who was studying the law, but it's the people of Newark that taught me about ideals of justice. And they taught me the understanding that, yeah, there are a lot of big issues, but if our children and our elders do not have environmental justice, if they don't have the ability to enjoy what should be a fundamental birthright in this country, if they can't have access to clean water and clean air, clean soil, a clean environment, then all the ideals that we preach in this country are a lie. And so we have work to do in America. Environmental justice must be at the center of our activism as a country in the fight to make real on the promise of America. We make a pledge, we salute a flag, we swear an oath to the ideals of liberty and justice for all. Well, I have been from North Carolina to Alabama, up and down the state of New Jersey, and I am telling you, we do not have liberty and justice for all. And so we are going to fight, and hopefully with this piece of legislation have more tools to fight to make sure the ideals of our country, the sworn oath that we all taken, is more real for more children.